Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Joe, what's happening?
Hey, good morning, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. Great to have you back.
Yeah, good to be back.
I'm making, this is like turning into a little like our Friday meetup.
Yeah, a regular series.
Yeah. So we had a great episode last week, and you wrote another article. You're like so prolific. You wrote another article about why you need a compliance program. So I'd love to just dive right in.
Sure. And the focus is how you sell a compliance program to your management, and not just how you make the first sale, but how you convince them that the program should be effective. And I try to follow the literature, what people think in this area. And I look at trends. One of the things I see quite a bit of is people almost saying, hey, forget all that legal stuff. That's not really the thing. This is about business. And you should be more positive and focus on how you can help the business and improve the business. So you're part of the team and you're not looked as the Department of Business Prevention. And there's some really good logic to that. And it's really based on some solid points. But I also think it's got some fundamental flaws if that's your only focus.
Yeah, if that's the only bullet you're firing, you're probably not going to win.
Exactly. And it's a counter reaction to people going in the opposite direction too far, which is doing it solely on the legal side. And if you don't do this, the government's going to get you. And the only reason to do this is so you can convince the government not to come after you, which is also wrong. It also goes too far. So what I decided to do in our publication, which is Compliance and Ethics Ideas and Answers.
Which I love, by the way.
Oh, thank you. And one of the nice things about it, it's free for anyone who is interested in the field. So I decided to look at 3 different cases for why you should have a compliance program: the business case, the legal case, and the moral case, which is a little surprising that many of the people who focus on the business side have an ethics orientation, but they don't make that argument that, hey, a really solid reason for having a compliance and ethics program is it's the right thing to do. So starting from the business side, where I think there really is a strong case about how we can add to the value of the business and the things we can bring to this. And one of the ones I like to start with is the yearly reports from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, who say that consistently, year after year, businesses lose approximately 5% of their gross, 5% from the top line, on waste, fraud, and abuse. And if you look at the elements that make up an effective compliance program, they're the same types of things that will uncover exactly that type of harm to the company. So while you're working to prevent the company from doing bad things, you're also working to prevent the company from being a victim of waste, fraud, and abuse. So when you're doing audits, when you're operating a helpline, all the different things you're doing, you're going to surface those harms to the business. Another thing that comes with that is you may uncover not just wrongdoing, but you may uncover weaknesses and flaws in the business.
Right.
And one of the keys to being an effective compliance and ethics person is to listen to people, to go out into the field, see what's happening, talk with people. And, we have a big push in our field to get folks to speak up and to call. But if we go out and we ask them, people who won't pick up the phone, people who won't send that email, they'll open up to you, they'll talk to you. There's not enough people in business who do this. So when the compliance and ethics people do this, they go out, they may discover mistakes, they may discover weaknesses. These are all things that can improve the business.
But it takes that proactivity, kind of to your point.
Yes.
It takes that proactivity. And when you overly rely on sort of these existing channels like a web form or like a hotline, there's almost like it's almost like a lower application of agency, because by its nature, it's sort of passive. By its nature, you're kind of like waiting, sitting back, hoping that your posters and your communications and so forth are going to prompt somebody to do it. That's a fine way to get some of that risk intelligence in as our friend Hema Lomax calls it. But to your point, there's also other kind of high agency things you can do to go out and go ahead and grab that information, engage with people, listen, and so forth, because it's out there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I used to teach in the SCCE academies, and I would talk about how you measure a program. And I would say, there's two tools that I like to talk about. One is called lunch and one is called beer. If you take workers out to lunch, now you don't have beer while they're working, but you take them out to lunch and you talk with them, they'll tell you all kinds of things. Now, another business reason for having a program goes back to when, I think as you know, I was co-founder of an online training company called Integrity Interactive.
Yep.
And we started out with the idea that someday we're going to sell the business, which we did. Well, if you're selling your business, you want to sell it someday to a bigger company, it's a strong point to be able to say, we have a fully functioning, effective compliance and ethics program. And it's the same if you're dealing with, you want to be a supplier to a bigger company. It's a positive. You want to sell to the government. It's not just a positive, it's an absolute requirement. And also for my lawyer friends, while you're doing this, you may discover instances where other companies are violating the law that hurts you. You may find competitors are engaged in anti-competitive practices. So the compliance program not only protects the company, but it really can add value in a meaningful way.
Well, on that point, Todd Ha wrote a really interesting article about compliance, not just as a shield, but also as a sword. And he was talking about some of those techniques or some of those approaches. It's not just a defensive. It doesn't necessarily only have to be limited to sort of a defensive posture. The ethics and compliance program, I'm saying, you can also, use it as a sword, so to speak, to your point.
But on the business side, I want to point out some difficulties in relying solely on this argument. If you picture this business argument and you're saying, okay, I'm going to go into senior management and I'm going to convince them to give me an additional $1 million because of all the value that I can add. And I can show to them that if they give me this $1 million, I will give them a 7% return on their investment or a 10% return, which sounds pretty good. The next person who comes in is marketing, who says, I can give you a 15% return on that same $1 million. The economic factor that's sometimes missing from these arguments is what's called opportunity cost.
Yeah, exactly.
And
it's not full economic cost. That's just sort of accounting cost. That 10% is just accounting cost. That's from an economics perspective. That's not like the full cost because it's not incorporating opportunity cost, to your point.
Right. And so if the same $1 million can get you 15% on something else, you're going to lose. And the point here is you don't depend on just one argument when you have other very important points that you can make. Another element to this is if you reduce your mission just to numbers, I mean, first, it kind of takes the heart out of it.
Yeah.
But it also sets you up for the first round of cost cuts. Because if all they are doing is
100%.
saying, okay, you add to the business, but hey, everybody's got to take cuts, and therefore, okay, we're just going to cut out all this helpline stuff because that generates a lot of additional
noise.
cost.
Yeah,
and we're going to cut down this. You have all this harassment training in California. We're just going to cut that out because we don't really believe our people are going to engage in harassment. You've reduced yourself to the same level as like the cost of coffee in the cafeteria. And so when people make the business argument, they should consider all these other positives and all the benefits that you can bring, and things like employee morale and retention and recruiting of people. There's real value there. You may not be able to quantify it, but it's certainly worth putting in there. But you also need to keep the other arguments in mind. But I absolutely agree that your perspective should not be just we're the police, we're the Department of No, but you also need to keep those other things as part of it.
So in my experience, I just find people don't make that business argument. I don't know if they're not comfortable doing it. Like your point is taken. If I'm all else equal, picking between two different investments, quote unquote, a marketing investment that's going to generate twice the return that a compliance investment is going to make, well, people on average are probably, again, all else equal, they're going to pick the thing with the higher, return.
Right.
I just find that in our space, people are not even comfortable making that argument. And like you said, the most important word, which is argument, and we can't just make one argument. You have to have a bouquet of arguments, or you have to have many flavor profiles, as I say, in the dish. But, what it kind of comes down to is, selling or influence. And you open the article by saying, we're selling all the time. What made you what brought you to frame compliance as a sales job versus just an ethics legal kind of a job?
Because you have to reach people. I fundamentally define compliance programs as two elements: a management commitment to do the right thing and management steps to make that happen. That involves influencing people. It involves reaching people. You're always competing for people's bandwidth, for their attention. And if you're trying to reach people, you're trying to sell to people, you've got to start not from what you want, but what your customer, what the people you're talking to want, what their interest is. And to get that, you need to talk to them and you need to listen to them. And I make this argument about convincing boards. Don't think in the collective, think of the individuals. A board may have 11 people. One of those people may have been in a company where the compliance training was just awful, and they hate compliance programs. Well, you need to listen to them and then say, I hate that kind of training too. I can guarantee you, we will never do that kind of thing. You can't make that argument to the group, but if you're making it to the individual, it can work better. And so when you're talking to a board member who's been in another company, you might start by saying, well, what did they do in that other company? And what did you think of it? And what do you think of what we're doing here? So they know you're listening to them. And then you'll know what's the best business argument, what's the best legal argument, and how receptive will this person be to the idea that you want to make sure the company does the right thing, that this is a company that has a very strong ethical history, and that's why the person came here. And what we're trying to do is protect that moral high ground that we believe the company should occupy. To the person who's a quant, who's a numbers guy, you don't make that argument. You make the numbers argument.
That's right. When did this hit you personally, that this was something that needs to be sold, and B, who are some of the hardest people that you've had to quote unquote sell compliance to, either yourself or anecdotally that you've heard?
I'm a 20-year corporate guy. When you live in a company for 20 years, you learn this stuff. You know the signals that you get from management. You know what the strong points are. You know what's going to sell people. And you know the importance of the working people, the people who are at the ground level. And you know what's important to them. I will say one example I had of a sales method in a company was doing just a review, talking with employees, doing a review of files, and finding some god-awful paper, some really scary stuff. And when you show that to management, you get their attention. So it's really that on-the-ground experience working with what we now consider compliance people. And back when I started, that wasn't necessarily the way you characterize them. But working with the people in-house who were trying to do the right thing. And your function was to help them and to help them get that job done. And so you'd have to work with management, you'd work with the employees, you'd be dealing with the real world aspect of this.
There are people throughout the organization that define themselves by, or hold in high sort of regard, the concept of doing the right thing. Those people are not just in the compliance department. And kind of getting back to what you were saying about getting out into the business and lunch and beers and stuff like that, you really increase the odds that you're able to identify those people and figure out how to resonate more with them. To your point, there's no silver bullet in this game of persuasion or in this game of influence. You have different groups that have different priorities, different personalities, different things that they're trying to solve for. And until you know what those micro audiences actually care about, the odds of your message landing and ultimately pushing them in a different direction or having them change their mind to endorse your, program or your initiative kind of falls through the floor. You're really kind of coming at everything with one dimension.
Well, it also touches on a structural point. And you'll notice when you and I talk, we're always going to wander off our original trail because there's so many interesting subtopics. I'm a big believer in having compliance and ethics ambassadors and champions throughout the company. and on a two-way basis. How do I know what's happening in the Pittsburgh office? Well, we have a compliance champion there who works with management, and she can tell me, well, look, this is their hot button right now. They're under pressure from the city government, blah, 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 such and such is happening. This is really their focus. And so I can work with her on what their concern is and then how we reach them. So I think that's part of the listening in a big company, is to make sure you have people out in the field.
Yeah,
Now,
but it's also part of the like creating the circumstances for that listening. Like these champions, as you call them, are not just going to like magically pop up. You have to like create the circumstances for that. You have to build those kinds of relationships. And I've been in the space for about a decade, and it's interesting to me that like we're still kind of talking about it. I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about it. But it's interesting that like this has not taken hold, and this is not like part of everybody's playbook. And why do you think that is? Do you think it's just that we're not naturally, some folks are just like wired for persuasion. Like my daughter, she's going to argue every point, she's going to always try to get what she wants. She's like, I'm like, you need to be a lawyer or you need to be a salesperson or something. Cause she's always trying to influence and change our minds and so forth. Not, I have other children that are not like that at all. And I think that wiring is maybe doesn't sort of naturally self-select into this space. Maybe that's a reason why, but I think that is something that we can learn, this ability to kind of listen better, actively listen, understand what somebody's angle is or how they want to be perceived. Like these are all things that we can start to tune into. But why do you think this is not like, part of everybody's playbook as like, one of the base skills that we need in order to build a strong program?
I'll mention, on a sympathetic point about our children, my daughter had the ability to remember every single thing that I said. So if I ever said anything that was contradictory to what I was telling her then, I would be reminded of that.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much our children can teach us. But I think, Nick, there's a lot on the agenda here. One of the reasons also I push incentives is organizations use incentive to send messages and to reach people. And so, for example, I would have every business unit manager who has a compliance person. I would have every manager assessed in part on how well they work with their compliance champion. So you build in an incentive for people to pursue this. And there's a lot of discussion about incentives and how this works. But if there's something you want to get done, the incentive system is a way to use it. You don't have to hit people with a sledgehammer, but it can just be part of what they're aware of, that this is one of their goals, this is one of their objectives. Similarly, your compliance champion in the business unit, their annual evaluation is done by the business unit management and the compliance officer or the compliance department. So all these management tools are there to use. We have to learn them. And like the ability to do active listening, it can be difficult, but it's something people need. It's a good life skill to have, but it's a good compliance skill. But I did also want to talk about the legal piece of this and why that's so important. And you start with the point that some compliance program steps are mandatory. They're not optional. Unfortunately, when government mandates compliance program steps, they tend to be box-ticking items because that's easy for the government to measure. And so California, for example, for harassment training requires 2 hours every 2 years. How did they know that? They didn't. They had to pick a number. So they picked 2 hours every 2 years. It's supposed to be effective, but they don't measure that. So right. It leads to box ticking. But it's important. You can't ignore it because if you violate that, that's a violation of law.
Well, and that, to your point, kind of creates an incentive structure that people are solving for. It's exactly. Easy, right? You say 2. Okay, it's 2 hours every 2 years. That's something that's it's objective. It's easy to measure. It's easy to see if you're inbounds or out of bounds for it. And then to your point, that then becomes the top priority on the list, on the hierarchy of,
right. And the other piece is nobody cares whether it works. All they care about
exactly.
is good. I always picture the general counsel sitting there with a clock saying, okay, 2 hours is up. See you in 2 years.
Exactly. Well, that's ostensibly what it turns into.
Meanwhile, everybody in the class is there with this, doing what they consider important. They're on their phones doing work while the training drones on. Now in California, it has to be interactive. So in the last 2 minutes, they ask for questions.
Exactly. Again, that's the incentive
Right.
structure that is being presented, and people are going to solve for that in the most efficient way they can.
There is another way to do this, which tends to not get the respect and acceptance that it should, which is more the incentive-based system of the sentencing guidelines and the Department of Justice. Because in that system, they basically give you the categories of things you need to do. They leave it to you, but they don't leave to you whether you're going to do them or not. Like, if you want to get credit from under the sentencing guidelines or from the government, you cannot ignore incentives. It's a minimum step that you have to do.
Right.
You have to do something in that area. But in this context, it's typically discretionary with the government. The government holds the cards, and the government, they're going to talk with your people. They're going to know what's going on. And the standards of the government, this is kind of counterintuitive. We tend to think of the government as kind of bureaucratic, not knowing what they're doing. Both the sentencing guidelines and the DOJ guidelines are excellent. They're outstanding. They really hit the point. They didn't do it on their own. They did this based on input from compliance and ethics people, from knowing what's going on in the field. So these are critical elements. People, it's just funny. The sentencing guidelines, the standards are not long. They're a page and a half. People don't read them. They don't read them. They're not difficult. They don't read them. People consistently leave out the incentive piece. They leave out the requirement that you've got to evaluate to determine whether a program is effective. But these standards are really, they're very good, very management oriented. And one of the concerns I have about the business argument, you might convince business they need a compliance program. And what they're thinking is, okay, we'll have a code of conduct, we'll have the lawyers write it, and we'll have some training, and then we'll have everything we need. Well, no, you've done next to nothing. When you look at the sentencing guideline standards, you have to evaluate effectiveness. You've got to take steps to prevent retaliation. You've got to do checking and monitoring. You've got to focus on incentives. All of these things, which are really good management points. And my concern is if you just stick to the business argument, the business people, they're not going to give up power to you. They're not going to offer for you to have a say on who gets promoted, which is a key element if you're going to have an effective program. And I think people miss this. I think they're right, you can make a business case, and they're right, you can convince management to implement a compliance program. If you don't have the more realistic, management-oriented standards of something like the sentencing guidelines or the DOJ guidance, you're not going to get a program that's really set up to work effectively. And then if you saw my third point in this was the moral case. And it's funny because our publication is practical. We're oriented toward the how-to, giving people ideas and answers. But there's a concept I might call moral hubris, where people feel that they're the only ones who care about what's right and wrong.
Totally.
And it's just not the case. And this was brought home to me early on in my compliance and ethics career when I was one of the people who ran the Practicing Law Institute program on compliance program, the educational programs for lawyers and people connected to the legal field. And I was giving a talk on exactly this subject, how you sell compliance. And I took a poll of the audience. What was the best method? The answer was, it's the right thing to do. That was lawyers saying that that was the strongest argument.
Do you believe that? Or were those hands going up from moral hubris?
No, I think it was, I think they really believed it. I think they really,
Interesting.
They really thought that was the case.
I guess then the question comes down to what is it? It is the right thing to do. It is what? Having a program. What is that program? Is it an effective program? Is it, or on the one hand, or is it merely, training in code?
I'll take it from another perspective. And it's a function that I think is a critical function for ours that's sometimes pushed aside from the business case. We have to be the voice for people who don't have a voice. When we're in-house, there's an enormous pressure to go along with groupthink. And when the
Totally.
boss says, we've got to do this, we've got to make this number, we're all like, yeah, here, compliance can help you make that number. Yeah, but compliance has got to protect the people who aren't in the room. Compliance has got to protect the workers, the customers, the investors, the public, the people who the folks in your room are not thinking about. They're thinking about the CEO. They're thinking about whether they're going to get promoted, their evaluation. They're thinking whether their boss is going to be happy or mad with them. They're not thinking about the potential victims. And so one of the things we should be doing as communicators, as trainers, is bringing people to that point where they understand the why behind this. Like, people in our field tend to disparage the law. And for example, for me, when I think about overseas corruption, I don't think about the language of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think of the people who are the victims of this. When I see things about due diligence with respect to modern slavery, I don't think about what California law requires. I think about people who are literally enslaved and forced to spend their time on the phone scamming elderly people out of their life savings. So we need to be the voice for the people who can't be in the room. And that does come down to the do the right thing, and understanding when we're dealing with, quote, the law, what the real purpose is, who the people are that we're protecting. And to me, that's a powerful point in reaching people and getting them to understand this.
So I think the problem with that argument, though, is this moral hubris problem that you talked about, because I think it only works, again, no one of these things work, right? So we're just talking about kind of pros and cons of each one of these sort of arguments, the legal, the business, and the moral in isolation. Right. The problem with just the moral argument is that it only really works and resonates if you can, turn the light bulb on for somebody and they realize that you're not doing the right thing. There is that sort of countervailing force of the moral hubris, though, where most people would consider themselves moral, like 2% or 1% or whatever of people are true psychopaths. And even they justify what they're doing. It's a very sort of twisted justification, but human beings are kind of these rationalization machines, and we're able to rationalize behavior. And to some degree, it seems like most people have some level of this moral hubris. And so relying only on that, there's just so many sort of terms that can be sort of misinterpreted. And there's so many different argument angles underneath that umbrella that sound good. And you get sort of like verbal assent to, again, all the lawyers raised their hand at the PLI and said, the most compelling argument is it's the right thing to do. Well, what does that even mean? Does that mean compliance is at every single conversation then? Yes, we need to have a compliance program. The best reason to do it is it's the right thing to do. Okay, well, what does that actually entail? Does that entail compliance determining promotions? Does that entail some kind of, ethics standard in everybody's annual review? Does that entail, all major decisions going through compliance with that, with veto rights? It probably doesn't entail all those things when those hands were going up. So, how do we sort of overcome that? Well, maybe that's the answer. Maybe the answer is you can't just kind of rely on one or the other. And perhaps, again, I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Maybe all people sort of cluster into sort of three groups. Some are like performance folks. Some are like, doing things right, like not getting in trouble folks, like high conscientious folks. And others are like, I don't want to get in trouble folks. If those are the three sort of like groups of people from a motivations perspective, well, then you have to kind of paint with these different sort of primary colors in different degrees to resonate with them. And maybe it kind of comes back to that active listening and understanding the audience.
Yeah, I think that's right, because your comments are kind of maybe pushing it to somewhat extreme examples, but the points are legitimate in terms of, first, you've got to convince people this is something they should be interested in, they should do, and then you get to the how-to.
Yeah.
But you first have to make the sale before you determine what color product they want.
Right.
And so you first have to get them interested, and that's best done when you take the approach of the good salesperson who wants to know where the customer is coming from before they talk to the customer. And so if you know that someone, if you know someone's had a bad experience with a compliance program in another company, you got to first make it clear, you know where they're coming from, and that's not what you're going to do. It's those kinds of things on a one-on-one basis that move people along. But I think your point that I think we're in complete agreement. You don't ignore any of these three, that you use them all. You don't go too far in any one direction. If I completely forgot the business argument and the legal argument, and I was just making the moral argument, no, that's not a recipe for success. But
yeah, it's all three together to varying degrees, to your point. Were you surprised by that response at that PLI conference, that it was the right thing to do?
I was, because I was expecting a more kind of legal oriented approach, that it's to prevent litigation and prosecution and that type of thing. Now, I don't think anybody in the audience was saying you ignore the other points.
100%, yeah.
They were merely saying, in my estimation, that, yeah, there is a value element to this, that it's not simply some mechanical thing. It's not simply out of fear that the government's going to get you, that it's deeper than that.
We talked a little bit about this moral hubris. How have you seen this kind of arrogance damage a compliance culture? Because part of the problem with moral hubris is people don't know that they're, exhibiting that. I don't think people know that they are that thing.
I think I see it more. I see it more on commentators outside of companies, where they're not the people who are kind of ethics oriented, but they're making the business argument. And I don't know. I think it's just that they're not really thinking about this element, and they may not realize that other people have a similar moral compass to what they have.
Mm-hmm.
So I would put it that way. The more important element to me is this personalizing what the law is. That instead of dismissing the law as something that's dried out, minimalistic, you're almost
fair standards,
right.
Table stakes type thing. Yeah.
Right. Instead of thinking that way, think in terms of the victims that's meant to protect. I have this discussion now locally, because we're going to have a program in our small town on human trafficking. And the point I emphasize is, when your elderly mother gets a call from a scammer, it is some poor victim who's been imprisoned in Cambodia, who's working 14 hours a day making these calls. And so if you think that human trafficking doesn't affect you, think about the elderly people who are having their life savings stolen.
Yeah. I didn't even know about that. I didn't realize that those were enslaved people making those calls about being a Nigerian prince or whatever.
That's exactly what's happening. It's moved over now to that is the major source.
That's crazy.
Those types of calls. So when we're talking about due diligence in your supply chain, we're not talking about some technical thing that some bureaucrat in Washington is requiring.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about protecting our elderly relatives from being ripped off.
Yeah. And I think tying it down to that sort of personal, kind of to your point, tying it down to the victims, the people, the human harm, helps sort of personalize and humanize the law, the regulation, the due diligence, the process, whatever that is.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I just wish my friends on the business and ethics side would stop minimalizing law and treating it in this kind of disparaging way, because number one, there are real values behind it, and number two, it's an extraordinarily difficult task. It's extraordinarily difficult to get people to understand what the rules are and follow them. It's something where you have to be diligent on an ongoing basis, and not consider it as some minimal tick box steps that you don't think about, that you only think about the business or the ethics side.
So, there was that other article that you wrote that was kind of on this topic that I'd love to just talk about for a couple of minutes. Where does that come from? This view that the law is just kind of, I don't know, stupid. Stupid, maybe a stupid word, but it's the ethics are over and above the law. The law is just this sort of bare minimum.
Right.
The law itself, I mean, just to be sort of like intellectually honest and fair, is itself this sort of amazing construct that is meant to help guide society. There's, obviously there's stupid laws and all that kind of stuff, but like there's a lot of intentionality behind it. And these are guardrails that are meant to try to provide structure to a society in terms of like what's in bounds, what's out of bounds, and so forth. And yet, to your point, many of us in our field, or many of us sort of, in the economy, whatever, tend to sort of look at it in almost like a disparaging way. Like, I'm ethical. I don't really care about the law. I'm ethical, like as if that sort of supersedes it.
Right. Like I'm above that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
One of the things I point out to people is that actually values conflict. And the law, in a certain way, is a tiebreaker among different values. It says society has decided that this is a critically important issue. And I think the difficulty is it starts with an element of truth, that we shouldn't just go by what we think the minimum of a law is. And, one of the sayings you hear is that law is about what you have a right to do. Ethics is about what's right to do.
We love those little things, don't we?
And it sounds very clever, but it just ignores some of the reality that values are not that simple. Ethics is not that simple. One of the examples I like to use is you have three competitors in a market, and one of those competitors is a small company. It's run by veterans who fought for our country. They're struggling. This contract is their major contract. You don't need it. You don't think your competitor needs it. So you call up your competitor, your other big competitor, and say, look, let's let this little guy have that contract. Let's give him a break. That's moral, that's ethical, and it's a criminal violation for which you go to federal prison for 10 years.
Yeah, it's a felony.
It's a felony. Is it ethical? Yes. Is it criminal? Yes, it's also criminal. Because there's a value there protecting competition. And it's why when you're looking at the law, instead of thinking about, oh, this is just some detail thing, think of it in terms of what's the purpose there. And the other example I always use is about preventing bribery. And to me, I see bribery as not just something that's illegal. I see it as something that's evil. And
Tell me some more about that.
I get pushback from academics on using a term that's emotional, but that's the way I feel.
Evil. They don't like that you say evil because that's
no.
Okay.
I was rejected by one.
You can say that to me.
Yeah, I was rejected. I went to write an article about this by some academic organization, and they wouldn't do it because I insisted on using the word evil.
And what was their pushback on that? That was too subjective, or it was too...
Yeah, too subjective, too emotional, not academic enough. I don't know.
Interesting.
But my point is, don't disparage the law. You're right to go beyond, like, looking at what's the minimum the law requires. That's always a mistake anyway. If you're trying to drive along a road and your goal is to stay right on the border, the edge of the road before you fall off a cliff, if you're staying that close to the cliff, you're going to go over the cliff. So you don't look for what's the minimum. You look at what's the purpose, what is the value behind the law, and how can we promote that. So
just curious, back to the bribe thing. Why did you choose that word? What's evil about it? Like what's unique about that perspective? I want to just kind of unpack that a little bit.
Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the person, but I read a comment by, as I recall, it was a young African fellow who, when talking about bribery, his expression was, we should call evil by its name. And that always stuck with me. Yeah. And bribery, anti-corruption is an area that I've focused on my career. I've done some work for the Department of Commerce on that, talking with people in that area. And I've seen like a presentation from the group in the World Bank, the INT, where they showed the impact of corruption. They showed what was supposed to be a road that, they paid a whole bunch of money to have built, and it was just a dirt trail through the woods. And you think of the impact that has on people. And for me, it comes down to that issue of the impact on people. So we should not be disparaging the law. We definitely should be pushing people to go beyond the minimum of the law, but we shouldn't be disparaging the legal side. We shouldn't be dismissing it as if it's just some kind of empty box ticking that we have to do.
So we talked about the legal case. We talked about the business case. We talked about the moral case a little bit. And your kind of position is that we can't use one over the other. We have to be able to kind of pivot between these different, flavor profiles or these different primary colors or whatever. But like in actual practice, you have a 30-minute meeting with a CEO. What do you lead with? And let's say the CEO is skeptical. Like, what do you lead with? Like, what's the best practice in reality?
Before I have that meeting, I know what the CEO is going to say because I've done my work. I've done my homework.
And you know the audience. You know what he cares about.
I've talked with the people who know the CEO, who might be, by that way, the CEO's administrative assistant might know the CEO. And so you prepare. And you don't go in deciding this is what I'm going to pitch because I know this is the strongest. You go in knowing what this person's concerns are, knowing they're concerned about the cost, for example. So you're prepared to deal with that. You're prepared to deal with how the benefits of the company are going to generate more than the cost of the program. That's your pitch if you know that. If this is someone who has had an experience with a company that went through a raid by the Department of Justice, you're going to know that, and you're going to be able to tell them this is how I'm going to prevent that from happening here. So it's exactly the same mindset as a salesperson would have. What's this person looking for? What color do they like? What brand do they like? You're thinking in terms of where they're coming from, and that's how I'm going to start. Now, if it's a bank, I gotta tell the person, look, here's what the government says you have to do. If you don't do this, you're going to get in all kinds of trouble. That's got to be in there.
For sure.
And the CEO is going to know that anyway, but you got to make that point. But I would look at what I know about the person and what's going to resonate best with them. I'm likely to include in one way all three of the points, but I'm going to focus on where he's coming from.
I'm a big fan of combat sports. Like I love boxing. I love MMA. And you see these folks that have different things that they've studied. Maybe they've studied wrestling or they've studied boxing or they've studied kickboxing or whatever. Despite that, despite that sort of basis that they have, this thing that they initially were acclimated to, every single fight's different. And you're fighting somebody that, maybe you're a boxer and you're fighting a wrestler. We have to fight that person different than you fight a kickboxer. And so just like every sort of fight is different, it's a different sort of application of the mix of skills or the mix of, styles that you may have learned. It's always going to be a function of your opponent or your adversary or the person that you're trying to convince, to your exact point. If this CEO just cares only about the bottom line and so forth, well, then you have to be able to lead with that business case and sort of bolster it with some of those other things, the right thing to do. And, we're going to stay out of trouble. But there seems to be this desire, and maybe it's just like a human desire for like, well, what's the formula? What's the checklist on how I communicate this to the business? And it kind of, interestingly, maybe this is kind of a through line. It removes that human element that kind of is the basis for the law. That human element is really what we have to focus on. Who is the person that I'm speaking to? Who is the person that I have to build a relationship with in order to get that flow of risk intelligence from an ethics champion or a compliance champion perspective? Who is the human being that I'm trying to convince from a power differential perspective, whether they're a CEO or a CFO or whatever? What do they care most about? If we just come to every single conversation with the same script, the same talking points, it's just never going to resonate, and you're going to stay kind of stuck.
Well, Nick, you distracted me with your fighting example because now I have to use my personal example. My hobby, and I'm extremely into this, is social dancing, ballroom dancing. And when I do the waltz, I always start the same way. I don't start moving forward. I go once to the left, once to the right on the timing. So when we're done, she knows how I lead. I know how.
There you go. Perfect analogy.
And if I'm going to ask somebody for a dance, I know what dance they like. So I have one person I'm going to ask for bolero because I know that she likes that. So you could probably use lots of different analogies.
But it's the exact same thing I'm talking about.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's exactly that. You have to know your audience. You have to know the person you're talking to. You need to have this other information though. Like I love the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners 5% number. 5% of gross is a big number.
Well, it's also 5% of the bottom line, by the way.
Yeah. And well, if you take off 5% of gross, you're definitely going to have an effect on the bottom line.
Well, I'm saying that it's 100% of that 5% is coming out of the bottom line.
Yeah. And so you're likely to surprise the person you're talking to, because they're going to expect you to come with, here's the law, here's what we have to do, here's what's going to happen if you don't do it, especially from coming from a lawyer. But instead to come in with that 5% figure, which odds are that's going to resonate with them. They're immediately going to know, oh, wait, this guy's talking business. This is not just the lawyer talk. This is business talk. And, oh, I never thought of that the compliance program is not just to prevent our people from breaking the law, but it's to prevent others from harming us. And so I think you want to start off with the message that, hey, I'm not just here to give you the same message that the government's going to get you if you don't watch out. I'm here to tell you, look, here's one way that definitely is going to help the bottom line. It's going to help the business. And so you can weave in both the business piece and the legal piece. You know, why when you've got several good kicks, why decide you're not going to use the combat one?
Exactly.
Why decide you're not going to use one? Why not use whatever you got?
Exactly. You have to use whatever you got for the fight that you're in. So, after, you've been in this field for, decades, where do you think compliance is actually winning today? And where do you think we're losing?
Oh, where it's winning? Well, that's an interesting question. That I really can't say I've thought about where we're winning and where we're losing. I know things that we're not doing. We're still timid about key elements. We're timid about incentives.
Yes.
We're pretty much either don't want to do it or we're afraid to do it. And we're also timid about power and the need to have a really empowered compliance and ethics officer. And we're scared to death of going to the government and trying to shape the policy that affects us. I don't believe compliance and ethics people should be lobbying to have the Corrupt Practices Act removed, but we should be focused on government on what will promote compliance and ethics, what will help us the best, and informing them that people in government need to understand that it's not a quick fix by mandating that you have 1 hour of harassment training.
Right.
It's not the way to do it. And informing them of those things. Where was the compliance and ethics field when Europe was writing the GDPR and only protected compliance elements, I think, with respect to finance and not the other areas? So they wrote some really sloppy legislation that has an impact on compliance programs. So I see that's an area where we're losing. We're not talking with government. We're not doing enough with incentives. Absolutely not doing enough on the power issue and the compliance officer not reporting to the general counsel, but reporting to an independent committee of the board. And one other hot button for me is taking practical steps to prevent retaliation, including having retaliation as a risk when we do risk assessment. Be realistic. If you're in a big company, some form of retaliation is going on in your company, as Nick, you and I are talking right now. It's far more common than anybody wants to admit.
Yeah, so and it's probably orders of magnitude higher than what the average person will guess. I was at a conference and I asked how much retaliation is acceptable. And everybody, of course, said no retaliation, 0. It should be 0. And it's well, ECI put out that study, which I've referenced 1,000 times, that said something like 56% of people that speak up face some kind of retribution. That's way more than 0.
We did an excellent article by Keith Reed, who used to be the compliance person at British Telecom, who talked about using data analysis that uncovers patterns of subtle retaliation. You can do it by numbers, where you look at the database of people who've called in and you compare it to the treatment of people who haven't, and the numbers can be quite striking. So
yeah, they can be striking.
There's a lot of things people could do in this area, but I still feel we're not doing it. We're not doing it as much as we could.
I agree. And just to kind of rabbit trail on the retaliation thing, what I find interesting is that when I talk to some compliance people about retaliation, I get the thing I hear. I've heard this several times now. They say, well, is it real retaliation or is it just perceived retaliation? And my answer is the effect of it is the same. What is the point of having no retaliation? Is it why are we against retaliation besides it being quote unquote evil? Like seriously, like why is retaliation bad? I think it's because the way it makes that person feel, it drives more disengagement. The odds of them leaving the organization, aside from it being wrong, I'm saying from a moral argument, aside, it has like negative externalities, negative implications to the business itself. The odds of them leaving is higher, their engagement is lower, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And so just looking at that sort of like engagement sort of, angle of retaliation, or like from the impact of retaliation, whether it's actual retaliation or that person simply perceives retaliation to be happening, their like behavior is the exact same.
And it's not limited to that one person.
Great point.
People see
Great
this.
Point.
And so they won't call to report a violation. They also won't call to suggest an improvement. They won't call because they see a flaw in the business. Once they get the sense that nobody's listening, they don't call.
Right.
And you lose that. And it's a mistake to just use some very technical legal definition of retaliation. There's a wonderful Japanese saying that the nail that sticks up is the one that gets hammered down. You could have 20 people in an office and everybody cuts corners, does little things wrong, but the one person who speaks up gets called for coming in 5 minutes late. Everybody comes
exactly.
late. But now all of a sudden, all the focus...
You got a target on your back,
And the manager who's doing it doesn't think it's retaliation. They just notice that person now.
Right.
And so those are the types of things that show up with a statistical analysis. And that's the area where we need to direct more of our management attention toward how do we address that? How do we deal with that? What actual steps can we take?
So if a brand new chief compliance officer or a brand new compliance person read your article or listened to this episode today, like what's the one thing you want them to walk away from this, like doing differently tomorrow?
I'm going to focus on the selling, promote, and compliance program. And it's not just selling initially, it's selling all the time. And to just remember, read the article, remember those tools, and then use those tools where you think they're going to work. But don't ignore any of them. Use what you got. You got these 3 different areas of arguments and points that you can make. Use them. And you're going to be using them all the time.
And use them with confidence, to your point. We have to have that confidence and that boldness to like push that out into the world,
Yeah.
All right, Joe, this was awesome as usual. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for writing this article, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Okay. Bye now.
Take care.